Good afternoon, and welcome to our breakout discussion on the strategic playbook for open banking. I'm Hwan Kim, Canadian open banking leader for Deloitte, and I'll be your moderator today. Today, we're joined by executives from four leading Canadian financial institutions who are actively participating in various efforts to advance open banking in Canada. Joining us today, Ben Harrison, a partner at Portage Ventures, Franklin Garrigues, VP of Digital Channels for TD Bank Group, Hugh McKee, Head of BMO Partners at Bank of Montreal, and Saba Shariff, Head of New Product Development and Corporate Strategy at Symcor. From improving comparability of products to generating better financial insights, open banking has the potential to deliver benefits to Canadians. Open banking will also serve as a much-needed viable alternative to less secure screen scraping activities, which are growing its popularity in the Canadian market. Looking ahead, open banking will also enable new business models and create new ways to participate in the financial services value chain, potentially leading to implications like broadening the definition of advice or increasing deposit movements. More broadly, consumer-directed data sharing is also a critical pillar of Canada's evolution to a digital economy, fueling new value generation across sectors and strengthening the privacy of Canadians. These various complexities surrounding open banking make standing up a Canadian open banking model a no easy task. Today, we look to go beyond numerous discussions and debates on the right model and focus on the vision and a practical path forward towards the vision. Before we get started, a reminder that the audience can submit questions using the chat at any point in the discussion, and the panelists will be addressing them live through chat. So without any further ado, let's dive in. I think it's only fair to start the discussion by exploring the promises of open banking, because it'll only end up becoming a huge cost if it cannot enable the right applications that Canadians need and want. We often hear the promise of open banking with use cases like personal financial management apps and loan adjudication cited as potential benefits. So I'd like to start the panel discussion by asking our panelists, in your opinion, what are some of the most promising applications of consumer-directed financial data portability that are much needed in Canada? Franklin, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Hwan, and thank you for having me. It's an exciting topic that I care a lot about. I'll start by saying open banking is an ask by Canadians. We think of it as at TD we use the term data democratization. We see it as the appetite by customers, by consumers to be empowered by using their data as they wish. And so it is a big movement, and we feel we want to support Canadians to share their data in a safe manner. You're asking what's the most exciting use case, and of course, PFM is a beginning. Loan origination, account opening, a lot of financial services would naturally be enhanced with open banking by sharing financial data. But when you look beyond, there's a lot of ideas out there. There's a lot of concepts that are being launched or experimented with that may already exist in Canada or not, but that are quite exciting and taking data beyond pure financial. Think of it as, for instance, when we were looking at recently is the ability to compute your carbon footprint by leveraging your financial data. That's pretty cool, and that is something that I know a lot of Canadians would enjoy. And it's just one idea among many. That's really the promise of open banking, opening up data, democratizing data.
Thanks, Franklin. Ben, what are you seeing from the innovation sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some very practical benefits that we're already starting to see, excuse me, in other markets that are much needed in Canada. Beyond Franklin's point, what the promise of open banking holds, I think the one area that you come to first, and not only because of the current situation we're in with small business and businesses in the pandemic, is cash flow lending, pre-qualification, ongoing pre-qualification of small business lending. Canada, relative to its OECD peers, is not really good at lending to small business. The difference between the interest rate that's used for or available to medium and large companies versus small companies is one of the worst in the OECD. And so the promise of cash flow lending and using alternative data sets to make those lending decisions for small business is a huge opportunity. In addition to all the benefits that come along with the financial management aspects of just helping small businesses run their business more efficiently through the use of alternative data, I think the same sort of opportunities also apply on the individual consumer side, whether it is individual cash flow management and insights. I think we all appreciate the challenges that financial decisions present for the mental and physical well-being of individuals, and the anxiety that financial decisions cause, and the disengagement that it creates. And so creating and presenting some of these insights in an easier way and a more actionable way, I think, is really important. As is, there's also great lending applications, I think, on the consumer side around the balance people carry on their credit cards. On average, I think in Canada, it's over $4,000. The idea of using alternative data to lend against those and help people clear those balances more efficiently and more quickly. Like, these are very real applications. And I think fundamentally this is all about getting individuals and businesses more engaged in their financial lives. And I think there are some very practical, real use cases today. And I think the future is unknown, and I think really exciting as to what new opportunities could present themselves.
Thanks, Ben. Hugh, how about you?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Hwan. I mean, I've always found it a little bit difficult. Like, I sort of feel like this is 1995 trying to predict what's the future of the internet, and your window is so tight. So if I was to maybe bring it up one level, I'd say the thing that I'm most excited by is actually the open architecture, right? So this is less about, in our case, what does a bank build versus what does a fintech build versus how do you blur the line between those things. And I think that's actually opens itself to something that can be quite exciting. How do we take fintech capabilities and embed them into a customer value proposition? How do fintechs take bank capabilities and embed them into their value propositions? I think that's where the magic is really going to happen. And then I think the other point, Hwan, that I would make is I think banking, in my mind, like in the end of the day, this banking is going to be whatever it is, 10% of what this thing is versus all of the other stuff. So that concept of a broader data right, all of the data that a customer has to offer. And I think the unlock and the value here for customers is aggregating multiple pieces of data. Banking is one of them, whatever it is, retail data, your loyalty data. There's a whole bunch of other things that I think can be amalgamated and actually be quite exciting on that basis.
Thanks, Hugh. Saba, over to you.
All right, thanks, Hwan. And I love all the responses from the panelists. I actually love the term data democratization, because I do think that that's what this is all about. The PFM and the loan adjudication, they're going to remove a ton of friction. I look at my own household, got multiple relationships, banking relationships, investment relationships. So having that aggregated or centralized and being able to make better decisions is great. But I don't think you could say that we're underbanked. We're perhaps overbanked in our particular household. So for me, one of the most promising applications is around financial inclusion, and looking at the unbanked and underbanked, and what can we do to either improve financial literacy, giving the right information to those consumers to be able to make the right decisions. Ben spoke of it in a small business aspect, but microloans, or getting offers to get out of debt, or early indications of potential default, because once you go into that default for a loan, it's so hard to come back. So you really don't want a consumer to get in there. So how do we help the less banked perhaps get access to necessary capital to increase their wealth and increase their choice? Is for me one of the most promising aspects of having access to this data and removing all the friction that we've talked about. But for that consumer set would be important.
Thanks, Saba. I think all those are certainly, the types of applications that makes me excited, and it makes me believe in the promises of open banking. But I also think those use cases certainly highlight why we need open banking and why we actually need to design it right? So we can actually enable all those different use cases. I think as we look to the open banking models, like I think we can all point to many unique circumstances that exist in the Canadian market, like our bifurcated regulatory system and others, that may constrain how we design open banking. And I think all the discussions prior has been within the confines of those constraints. But today we wanted to, I think, do something a little bit differently, because I think as all of the people on this call would agree, as with any good MVP design process, perhaps a better way of actually doing this is by looking at the unconstrained vision and start thinking about where we can start. So my next question to you would be, if there were no constraints and you had the full ability and control to design from scratch, what would ideal open banking look like for you, or open banking or consumer directed finance or open data look like for you? We'll start with Hugh this time.
Sure, thanks, Hwan. That's also a good question. Like I would say, and I think we're all highly aligned on this, is first of all, it's got to start with the customer at the center. And so making sure that they are appropriately protected, that they're managing consent, redress, all of those kinds of core things are quite critical. As I mentioned in my last response, I think that actually a broader data right is actually a fairly foundational element. So let's envision what this thing is truly beyond just banking, like all of the data that a customer has that is potentially more important than just banking data. I think the importance associated with that of data reciprocity is important. That's going to be a key to unlock the ability to do innovation, the ability to develop other concepts. I think another learning is just something that's actually nimble. Like kind of going back to the internet analogy, you need to have a bit of flexibility because it's hard to predict what's going to happen tomorrow in some of these things. And so something that's actually flexible, efficient, timely allows us to kind of have some degrees of freedom to move in terms of what the solution is, I think is quite important. I think we need to address some foundational issues like liability, as an example. And so, my personal belief is that more of a market-based solution is attractive in the sense that it provides things like the nimbleness and the flexibility. It enables things like how do you actually integrate multiple data points would be some of the things I would highlight.
Thanks, Hugh. Saba, we'll go to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Hwan. Yeah, and I think for me, you hit it, Hwan, with the question. This is about what's our end state vision, and let's kind of work backwards from there. So our end state vision really isn't about open banking or the banking aspect of it. It is about open data and data democratization and opening things up. So if you look at that unconstrained vision of what could I have access to based on my rights, data portability, data access, data rights, etc., that's ultimately, I think, where we need to start to look to. And then if you kind of break it down into strategic playbook of what needs to happen to enable that, I think we first have to all agree that that's the ultimate vision. You're hearing about open finance, but let's go beyond that. What about my health data? What about my insurance data? Building off of what Hugh said, I think that should be our ultimate goal, is to have the ability to remove friction in really any service or any industry. We're in a digital economy right now. There shouldn't be friction in other areas, not just banking. So how can we accelerate and enable that to happen? I do think it comes with first starting with the data rights and enabling the legislation or support that's necessary to make that happen more broad-based, and again, not just focused on banking. Obviously, that's going to take a lot of time, and it's not going to be instant. So I would agree that market-driven forces, creating the right ecosystem, an environment that incentivizes participation and collaboration is going to be key. So have focus on legislation where it's necessary to remove uncertainty, encourage participation. Like seed the environment is going to be important, but then collaboration amongst the industry is going to be key to move forward, and it's going to have to be a concerted effort. That takes time. Nothing like this happens easily, but I'm hopeful because I am seeing pockets of that collaboration, and I think we are seeing that happening in Canada. So I believe that it's going to be a mix of the right government support, but also market movement is going to be really important to move this ahead.
Franklin, what would be your vision?
Happy to share. I was hoping to get Ben to speak first because it's more of a stretch for bankers to think of a unconstrained world than for Ben. But I'll give my 2 cents. I agree with what's been said. It's customer first. Like ultimately, this is about empowering customers to share their data in a safe and secure manner and with as little friction as possible. That is really what it is about. And so to me, it's customers being authenticated in a safe way, probably with their banks, a customer consenting to sharing their data at a level with clarity and simplicity and at the level of granularity that's required and that they would like to see. Sharing data with a third party of their choice, without having them, without endangering customers and without putting the onus on the customer to determine who's a bad actor. So there's got to be some guidelines there, some guardrails. And then, customer having the transparency to understand what happened, where did the data go, who did I share it with, and ability to revoke that consent if they'd like, and also ability to call somebody if something goes wrong. This is really what the elements are. So that's the ultimate goal I think we're all trying to get to, and it's really about getting safety, security, privacy while minimizing constraints and friction. I also don't want to forget developers, because it's really a network where you have consumers on one side and developers on the other side. And success will be, the ideal solution is also a place where developers have a easy access to APIs, and so that means a easy way to same thing, like to as little friction as possible to contract and enter a relationship with the API provider, either directly to the bank or through a provider. But having in mind the ease of use for the developers is also important for the success and adoption of the network overall.
Thanks, Franklin. And Ben, please inspire us with your innovative vision.
Franklin's trying to butter me up here. I think about it in two parts, and I think the groups sort of touched on it. Like, one is, and actually most important, are the foundational elements that need to be in place. Like, we can talk about all the perfect design elements for an open banking infrastructure, but ultimately that needs to be built upon a strong foundation of, one, this understanding and belief and right of the consumer to control their data. And again, broadly, I believe this goes well beyond just financial services. I think the other really critical element is we need the legislative and regulatory infrastructure to create this environment. And I think that is a really important piece that's lacking right now, is the ability to and the resources within government to bring this digital economy to life. And I think we really need to be thinking differently about how we are building the regulatory infrastructure for this digital economy. So I think there's a ton of work that needs to go in there. From there, everything else gets easier. I mean, I think we're going to get into this in more detail, but when it comes to open banking, I think, the things we think about with what's the ideal state, it's not just open banking, it's open finance. We know what's going on around issues with scope of data, so let's address that up front as we're thinking about the design. I think we include payments. Payment initiation is a topic we're not talking about in the open banking conversation in Canada. And while it might not be a day one feature, it's something that we need to be building for looking forward. I think the availability of APIs, the more APIs out there, the better. It creates this strong developer community. And it brings to life this view that everyone has shared in one way, shape, or form of, we don't know what the true potential is today. And I think having access to those data sets and for the consumer will fundamentally help bring that thing to life and make it something that we can't even imagine today.
Thanks, Ben. I think a lot of the elements you guys talked about, I think they really resonate, right? In terms of that need for kind of bold vision around, actually a foundation that we need to set around how do we actually empower consumers to actually take control of their data, regardless where it's held, but also the more specific elements around how do we make that happen in financial services, I think are certainly resonating. But with that said, I think when I also look at some of the global jurisdictions, I think a lot of people have now under that vision made different choices, right? Like there are players like Singapore who went with more open finance vision to drive financial planning, or markets like Korea, which I think actually went to more open architecture, open APIs, to your point earlier, Hugh. And then obviously markets like Australia, who went to the consumer data, right? So I think given all these versions of open banking, I think there are things we can probably learn from them, both that are good things we can learn from them and then bad things we can be wary of. So considering some of the foundational elements like, the scope, accreditation, like technical standards, liability, and others, in your view, like what are the things we can consider from these other jurisdictions models and potentially adopt, maybe not holistically, but the parts that we can adopt and parts that we should actually be a little bit more wary of or be concerned about? Ben, we'll actually start with you this time.
Yeah, so I touched on a couple in my previous comments, but I'll maybe just go a bit into a bit more detail. I think in terms of learnings, I think scope is a big one. The scope of data. We started our consultation process 2 or 3 years ago, at the time when the UK and others were just getting going, and so by nature we limited our view of what scope would be. I think there's general agreement that going too narrow at this point doesn't really make a lot of sense given what we're seeing in these other jurisdictions in terms of the continued use of screen scraping in the UK and the fact that Australia laid out, I think, a pretty good roadmap for how they would include additional data into their open banking plan. I think accreditation, I think there's quite a bit to learn from the various accreditation models that have been deployed in other jurisdictions. The UK today has 300 plus TPPs that are in market with solutions. I think in Australia, we've got not so many. And I think there are some differences in the accreditation model that's been used, and aligning it more to activity and risk, I think, is something that we can probably learn quite a bit from. I think the comment I made earlier around payments and seeing that as something that is part of this open finance world, it doesn't, again, necessarily need to be something day one that's implemented, because again, there's just so much to do already. But I think having a clear view of where that fits into the open finance, open banking infrastructure is really important. And you've seen different ways that that's been brought to life in other jurisdictions. And then one other small thing, I think Franklin touched on it actually, is the improvement in the traceability of data. I think one of the comments I've heard from folks in the UK is if there was one thing that they could adjust or change about the model they've put in place as it relates to liability, is improving the data that's used to actually trace who gave consent to what parties, and to make sure that that is clear and understood and managed appropriately. Those would be a few of the tactical, I think, key learnings that we can use as we start to build out our open banking framework here.
Thanks, Ben. Hugh, we'll go to you.
Yeah, great. I think Ben raised some interesting points there. A couple of things. I do think there's actually a lot to learn from other jurisdictions, and we're probably fortunate that we are where we are. We don't want to sort of be on the bleeding edge of this. But the first one I would say, again, is quite foundational, that I think it just revolves around consumer awareness and education. That I would say that customer awareness of what is this thing, what are the benefits, why are we doing it, all of those kinds of things is dramatically low, I think, in many markets. And so that's something that has to be, let's not be sort of the hammer looking for a nail. Let's actually make sure that customers understand what they're doing. I think there's a lot around just getting our head around what the unintended consequences are of kind of going down these paths. That, like, if I look at the United Kingdom as an interesting example, where arguably the API is actually relatively narrow. Customer switching has actually been flat to declining over time. So you kind of look at this and saying, is it actually doing what we think it's doing? The cost to implement all of those kinds of things are important. Something that Saba touched on, I think we have to really think about this as a framework. Like, this is not something that's happening in isolation. We have to really understand what are the linkages to privacy, like Bill C-11. What about things like regulatory clarity that have to be in place to actually make sure that this thing works? Ben raised the concept of payments as an interesting example. So, like, I look at PayMod. We've been working on PayMod for years. That's kind of the mechanism to how to address things like payments. So you have to kind of make sure that all of those things are bolted together effectively to make sure that this goes well. And I would end with, the stuff I mentioned before. I think the benefits of things like broad data right, data reciprocity are important, and then maybe end with the point that I think we just have to be careful that we don't overbuild this. Like if you look at the changes that the UK is making to the implementation entity, I think that's an example of like, let's be careful. We need to maintain the flexibility. Let's not kind of make this overly burdensome.
Thanks, Hugh. Saba, any thoughts you'd like to add?
Yeah, no, I think both Hugh and Ben touched on some great ones. So lessons learned for me are really focusing on how do we maybe accelerate or seed this into something that's that can actually materialize in Canada. I know a lot of folks were a little bit disappointed when the latest budget came out, and that there wasn't focus, which is why I do think that there's momentum and opportunity for industry to advance things. I think we should build on some of the conversations at the recent consultations on the accreditation framework. Some of the delays in getting TPPs approved or others into the ecosystem can result from an overly prescriptive set of standards or expectations. Centralization of that activity can slow it down. So this concept of, hey, align on the principles and decentralize the work could maybe help move things forward a little bit more. I really like the concept of easier UI, UX. We've seen some friction areas when the right data wasn't captured, to Ben's point, and you can't easily manage your consent. I don't know where all my data is now. I can't really revoke or grant access in a centralized way. So that is an opportunity, I think, for centralization. I think maybe the other thing to learn is when it comes to technical standards, because that's the other option that you mentioned, maybe not being overly prescriptive, recognizing that if you do come in a little too heavy-handed or mandated in that regard, it's going to slow things down. There will be a huge effort for everyone to meet a certain standard. And I don't think you should expect that in this environment. I think we should allow for some flexibility of choice and design there. So some things to kind of learn from other jurisdictions where they have been a little bit too prescriptive, I think has delayed the time to market. So seed it with the right areas, seed it with the right focus, and then build on there and let the market move is going to be really important for us here in Canada.
Thanks, Saba. I think that certainly things like those slow accreditation process, I think has been a problem in every single market, and I think it's definitely a pitfall we can for sure avoid. Franklin, I'm going to ask you a little bit of a different question. Given TD has been quite prolific in trying to solve for open banking, not just in Canada, but also in the US. And you would have seen, everything from bilateral agreements happening between banks and aggregators and down to some of the more collaborative efforts to across banks to make those contracts easier, from the TCH to Akoya. So to you, we'd like to ask, like, in your opinion, like, why haven't those models come to Canada yet?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question, Hwan. When you look at so TD is indeed active on both sides of the border, US and Canada, and we've made public agreements we've signed with aggregators, Finicity and Intuit in the past year, with whom we have agreements to connect through APIs. And these agreements are North American, so we see that very much as being used in the US and as in Canada. And we're aware other Canadian banks have similar agreements, and we are currently working on other agreements with other aggregators on both sides of the border. So that's really much of a I would call it a North American trend. When you look at the market between the two countries, a lot of the same fundamentals are there. Screen scraping, everything started with screen scrapings and customers asking to access for data. And then some bilateral agreements, and then API-based target state that everybody agrees to. And so a lot of the common elements are there, and some elements are shared. The FDX came to Canada, and the standard seems to be increasingly adopted across the industry as a whole. Now, you're right to point out that Akoya and TCH involvement is kind of shaping the US market. The way I think about it is, I think Canada came a bit late to the party, and both in customer adoption, in the way it unfolded, Canada came a bit late to the party. But I am seeing momentum now across Canada, and when I talk to stakeholders in the industry in Canada, I see a bit of a consensus on the need to get there, the need to build a safe way, a safe manner for customers to share their data. And so while we're still at the bilateral contract level in Canada today, I know that there are discussions on could there be a utility? What would be the value of it? Could it help accelerate the momentum? It really much is at the moment a question of how do we accelerate the momentum? And I have to say, we're eager to see that momentum accelerate because we at TD, we're concerned about the current security position we're in that customers are using third party, they are sharing their data in a manner that's not sustainable and that is endangering themselves and the banks. And so we're looking at building that momentum, continuing it, and we think we're on the right track, but it's a matter of how could we accelerate that? That's really the mindset here.
Thanks, Franklin. I think you're absolutely right. There's been, despite all the delays with the government-led, I think, process, I think we've definitely started to see some promising developments in the industry to get started, as you pointed out. Maybe, Hugh, we can ask you to maybe share some of the work that you're involved with through kind of forums like the CIO Council or FDX or others, just so that people can understand what efforts are underway to kind of make some of the early efforts to solve for this open banking issue in Canada.
Yeah, happy to start. And Franklin, actually, I think given that he sort of participates directly, might be interested in commenting on that. But this is an area, like, I do think it's critical. Like, this is one of these ones where, in my mind, it's kind of do no harm activity, regardless of what path open banking takes in Canada. Addressing things like the technical standards is a very critical one. And I think part of the foundation for that, like, as Franklin mentioned earlier, the developer community, the cost to actually have fintechs be able to operate in this environment, all of those things would point to the idea that we need to sort of solve around sort of a data technical standard. And maybe it's not one standard. I'm not sure we need to kind of go that far down the path, but I think that something is we don't benefit from, kind of multiple standards unleashed. Like, I sort of look at it as, think of how frustrating people have had using video conferences, different platforms over the last year and a half. Like, it's been driving all of us bonkers. So that's something that I think we need to address. And I look at FTX, like, I think the path that we said we like this is that, first of all, it has broad governance. So not something that's controlled by financial institutions. It's like, look, it's a jointly governed by fintechs, by banks. That's mission critical in our mind. I sort of look at it as it's almost a de facto standard already. So many of the fintechs that we're working with already, that is the standard to which they're building for. And it drives a lot of North American interoperability, which I think is quite important as well, and probably the right access for us in terms of operational. And then the last point that I think that I find quite important is that it's actually a Canadian-based solution. So this is the thing where it's got the flexibility to evolve as a Canadian standard within a larger sort of operating environment versus let's go off and develop something that's kind of the 2% solution.
Thanks, Hugh. Franklin, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah. So FDX is there's been a lot of press and discussions on FDX. FDX Canada is doing quite well. We have a large number of fintechs and aggregators and banks that join, including credit unions, and so it's actually quite successful at representing. It's a forum where you see a lot of the industry dialoguing. It's quite interesting. I think there's been a few learnings since we launched in July. One of the learnings is that it is quite complex. Like, it's a standard on APIs connecting banks to third parties is quite complex, and there's a level of minutiae and of details that I think surprised quite a few folks. And so the magnitude of the task and the level of the amount of work that it represents has created a bit of some concerns. And so we're trying to make it more palatable, easier for smaller institutions smaller organizations to digest and to engage on. And I'm excited to see. So we're creating a bit of a local Canadian, Canadian solution, like you said, really to look at what does FDX Canada looks like and what are the specificities of Canada. And there's a lot of work going on to Canadianize the FDX standard. I'm also excited to see themes that Canada is pushing at FDX as a whole, and themes that are close to our what Canada is good at. For instance, there is a beginning of a dialogue on digital identity that is taking place at FDX, and with a strong role by Canadians. That's exciting. Canada really has something to say on identity, and this is a bit of a long shot, but are we seeing a convergence between open banking and identity? That would be great. I think it's worth investing time on this. also leadership by a Canadian entity of a working group on data quality, which matters a lot. And so, what type of data, how do we measure, how do we know data that is being shared is of good quality? So Canada is embracing FDX. On your question on the comment on the CIO Council, it's interesting. We early on, FDX Canada and the CIO Council signed an agreement that was made public, and MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, that really is agreed to share notes and be open with one another to share and compare notes and see how we're doing. And since then, we've been looking at ways to how can we collaborate. The CIO Council is a good vehicle to go towards being a national standard, but in the consultation and in dialoguing with the Canadian stakeholders, we've realized that there was a lot of appetite to keep FDX competitive, meaning a standard, not the standard of Canada. And I get the philosophical underpinning of that. It's good to be on edge. Technology keeps evolving, and so today's standard may not be tomorrow's standard, and there's nothing as good as competition to ensure an entity continues to evolve. And who knows, there may be another standard tomorrow. So I get the underpinning. That's what we're adopting, and so as a result, we're really looking to let's continue drive adoption, and adoption is the litmus test of success. You may have heard the FDX passed 16 million end users a month ago, and so that's a good news. Like it is being adopted at a fast pace, and so that's a very good omen for FDX overall.
Thanks, Franklin. I think from our discussion today that I think it's very clear that achieving the vision for open banking is likely a lengthy process, and will require multiple pieces moving forward, coming together, right? Like for everything from consumer data right to industry collaborations and standards, and actually the financial services specific implementation of those. And I think given the constraints, I think they're certainly not an easy task to move forward. But I think at the same time, I think everybody in this breakout agree with the urgency of enabling open banking in Canada so that we continue to promote vibrant innovation in the Canadian financial services sector, mitigate growing risks from screen scraping, and just to promote consumer welfare and business welfare in a much needed time. So my next question to you guys would be, practically, what can we do in the next, say, 6, 12, and 24 months to make real progress? So what are the things we can do to go beyond all these discussions? Because I think we had these discussions for the past 2 years. What can we do to actually make real progress in a shorter term? Ben, we'll start with you.
So I think there are a couple things. I think some of the comments that Hugh and Franklin made around work that's happening at the CIO Council and FDX are examples of some of that work that will likely continue. I think maybe just on the point of FDX, I think one of the challenges I think to date from the fintech community who's been participating is making sure the discussion around the technical standard stays within that lane versus steeping into other components of a framework around the scope of data. I think that's a really important distinction and design feature to understand. I think the acceptance of FDX broadly to date in Canada should be no surprise, given that the banks who control the vast majority of the consumer data that would fall under an open banking regime have sort of followed into that relationship. But I think making sure the technical standard discussion stays a technical standard discussion, and then discussions around scope and accreditation and all of those things be managed by another entity is an important consideration. And so, tying it back to what can be done in the short term, this might be the worst kept secret now in the open banking world. But appointing I think government coming in and making it clear that this is bringing this consumer data right to life and bringing it to life in the financial services sector is a process they will be involved in. And in order to marshal the resources of the ecosystem, appointing someone who has a responsibility to manage those discussions, while they might not in the short term, in the next 6 to 12, maybe even 24 months, have any legislative power behind them. I think having someone who it's signaled to the market the government will help set the foundation for this and be a participant in these discussions. Someone who can bring those resources together and point everyone in a direction to sort of help clarify what do we all agree with, where do we have our points of contention, and then how can we start to work through those. I think will be the most important step that we could take as a country to really accelerate and align as best we can on a path forward. And I think underpinning a part of that will be the advisory committee's report. So short term, I think those two things help get it going. If this open banking leader has the resources to put the structure of an implementation entity in place, I think that just adds additional strength and credibility to the process. And then I think, realistically, best case scenario, getting into the legislation and regs is 24, 36 months out. Like that's, but I think maybe 2023, 24 is like the year of fintech in Canada, right? Or because that's also going to be likely the same time that the RPPA, the new RPOF, is likely stood up. And I think bringing in the payments component to this all starts to get connected. So those would be in my mind, like the short term, the leadership appointment with authority, and then starting to work through the other components, looking at realistically, I think a 24+ month time frame here.
Thanks, Ben. Hugh, maybe we'll go to you. And any beyond, I think that the 24-month kind of time frame Ben laid out, any opportunities to actually like get something into the market, right? Because I think we all know that every day that people spend, screen scraping, this another day with risk in the marketplace, right? So would love to hear, like, beyond kind of the steps to get to 24 months time period, anything we can do in a shorter time frame.
Yeah, and I mean, this is always the peculiar one. Like people say, like, well, when's open banking coming? I feel like, hey, what have I done? Have I wasted my life over the last 2 years? Like that's what we've been doing, is negotiating agreements, starting to do data access. And so I look at it and say, to some extent, it's already started. Like our view is, we're not, like, at least within BMO, we're not waiting for someone to come to us and say, you got to do this. We're out there negotiating agreements, doing things that make sense. And what I see internally is the pace of those things is actually accelerating. So that'd be the first point. I do think that there's some sort of good hygiene things that we need to address. And so again, the timing of that, these are things that can actually start to happen right now, convene people to kind of work on this. And like off the top of my head, I would say, technical standards, as we talked about, is a good one. This is, fintechs are asking for that. This is the mechanism that they're using. That's quite important. Accreditation, I think, is a good one, where there's a fair amount of common ground. We talked earlier about regulatory clarity, so things around how do we address liability, whatever, OSFI rules and outsourcing. There's lots of things that we probably need to kind of just make sure that everyone understands the rules. And then I think Franklin raised a good one as well. What's the role of digital ID? The point that I would end on, Hwan, is that, like, I think counterintuitively, if we actually want to move really quickly on this and kind of get something going, you can actually rely on government legislation. Like, for many good reasons, globally, governments are really focused on other priorities that make a lot of sense. And even at the best of times, like as Ben mentioned, like, so does this become something that's, 2023 or 2024 or 2025 by the time the ball gets rolling and consultations and all of those kinds of things? And I look at it and say, you could be in the market, very quickly with more of a market-based approach, where we say, these are the things we agree on. And quite frankly, I think that's one of the most enticing things, right? Is this is the trade-off of ability to get to market quickly, ability to have something that's nimble and flexible, less, more efficient in terms of its delivery, appropriately bounded by, guidance from the federal government, as an example.
Thanks, Hugh. Saba, maybe we'll get your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think it's I would actually agree with both Ben and Hugh, and I can understand why there's push to, let's say, more active involvement from government. But I would agree with Hugh that isn't going to happen quickly. And I don't think any of us are. So it's the question of what can practically be done. And it's building on the momentum of this willingness to at least align on a bare minimum data scope, start sharing, take that minimal viable product approach, and start somewhere. And I do think that there's momentum and there's openness to doing that. I don't think a lot of people would argue that moving off of screen scraping for the data that's accessed today is that's a good thing. So let's actually put something in place that allows that to happen. So that's something that shouldn't take long, because we're building off of technical standards that have been put in place. We're building off of a data scope that's been agreed to elsewhere. We're really looking at moving something forward, and we can do it in parallel to these activities within the government for enabling better data rights, with thinking of an accreditation framework. I don't think we need to wait. And that would be my worry is if there is a more active role, that you then have participants who will be like, well, I'll just wait for those rules to be written. And once that gets decided, I'll participate. And that's the last thing we want. We don't want to kill market momentum to putting something forward. Whatever does get put forward has to be transparent. It has to be collaborative. It has to take in the views of all participants. And I think that's going to be key is industry being open to the various viewpoints, aligning on a minimal viable scope, and moving forward. So if we can do that, maybe it's not going to meet everyone's needs for the long term. I just believe we have to start somewhere. And I think that's going to be important for us to rally around what that somewhere is.
Thanks, Saba. Franklin, anything you'd like to add?
I completely agree with what was said. I will, I would say we have a sense of urgency. 24 months is far too long. We do want to get the credentials secured. We do want to remove that equation in which we're putting customers of having a trade-off between convenience and security. That's not sustainable. So we really have a sense of urgency on that. And so what can we do? It's about connecting APIs. It's about building API gateways. It's about entering, in the current framework, entering bilateral agreements and getting in motion on that. We're hopeful we're seeing motion on that. We're trying to elicit more, but that's really what I think is something we can very practically do in the coming 6-12 months.
Thanks, Franklin. Ben, I'm gonna come back to you on I think Hugh, Saba, and then Franklin pointed out maybe doing something in parallel, right, to the broader like a government-led regulatory foundation approach to get something out to the market and through kind of collaboration across the market. So love to hear your thoughts on it, and also like to hear your thoughts on what did it actually take for the industry as a whole, like everyone in the market, to actually work together to take those first steps.
Well, I think, as has been said by almost everyone, things are happening now. Like, and this is not a wait and see sort of decision. I think what is needed, and where I was going with my point, is not to say we're going to wait 3 years to get the legislation. Like, there's going to be stuff that's going to happen. That's just a function of how long it takes to work, through the political system. But I think getting all parties aligned on an open banking framework that really truly puts the customer at the center, that allows them to decide within reason the types of data that can be moved and the circumstances under which they can move it. Having that view, I think, requires, because I don't know that you've seen a true open banking framework put in place in any country without government in some way, shape, or form engage. And we've just chosen to take a much slower approach to this. So we've got a lot of work to do to catch up. And it's eminently reasonable that the industry has stepped in to manage this process in the meantime. But we need that oversight, I think, to align us on a path forward, and to ensure that the customer and the small business and those entities are truly at the center of this, and they're able to control the destiny of their data versus having it prescribed for them, and that it needs to be whole of market solution, that this can't be a whole series of bilateral agreements between different parties that make my experience, because I bank with one entity, different than my wife's because she banks at another. So I think all of these discussions will continue. I think what is needed is some clear signal that the government will own this, that they'll put resources behind this, and that we'll work together to develop the open banking model for Canada. So we're not going to wait. But at the same time, I think just letting market run this on their own is a solution that I think won't get us to where we ultimately want to be.
Thanks, Ben. Saba, anything you'd like to add?
No, I think I hit a lot of it in my mark. So it's a fair point, and I don't think anyone is saying do one or the other. I think we're all saying these things have to work in parallel and in conjunction and in collaboration. So we certainly see an opportunity in openness for collaboration. We're an entity made of a bunch of collaborators right now today, but I really love that everyone in their remarks has continued to put the consumer at the center of this, the consumer's rights, the protection of consumer data. And so I'm very hopeful. We joked about this the last, I think, conference or whatever that Ben and I were at, that I'm a bit of an optimist. But I do think that with the right momentum and support, and I 100% agree that you are going to need government to play their role, that's going to be a necessity. And with that, with market momentum, I think we can get something in place. And I agree with the whole of market solution wholeheartedly, that if you have a bunch of bilateral separate APIs, the customer's going to suffer. They're going to be confused. There's going to be poor user experience. The more we have both screen scraping and APIs, it's not going to be clear what method you use in one situation versus another. So that momentum and movement off is going to need, concerted effort. So I'm hopeful. The title of this session was the strategic playbook. And I think everyone here has kind of laid out some great steps and activities that can happen. But we are Canadians, and I always believe that Canadians can collaborate. We just may be a little bit slower to at it than the other markets right now.
Franklin?
Listen, I think we agree, right? Like Ben said, we answer by the foundations are known, the components of the framework are agreed upon. It's a matter of building them, and there's a bit of a regulation first or building them first. I think we are all agreeing regulation is going to be a bit slower, so if at all, and so let's build it. And so that's really what the task is at hand. And of course, like Saba says, we collaborate well, lots of discussions, lots of stakeholder engagement. At the same time, the path of bilateral and connecting through gateways is we know the solution. There's also solutions that are easier, that consist in removing the credentials without necessarily using an API all the way. So there's a few options on how to implement this fast. But that is the path forward. It turns to be, I was actually, I'll finish to say, I was actually happily surprised with at the end of the consultation, how much of a consensus there is on the solution. And that's a very positive sign that the debate is really more the how and how fast. And that's a good place to be. So I'm hopeful we'll move fast here.
Thanks, Franklin. Hugh, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's been well covered. Like, I view it as this is sort of a team-based sport here, and that everyone has a role to play. We don't need to kind of duplicate roles. Government has roles to play around setting guidelines and guardrails and things like that. Individually, we're out there, doing things like building portals. And that, again, I think there's sort of an approach whereby we can quickly start to get this moving as a collaboration across the entire market, fintechs, the government, banks, et cetera. I think can all sort of play a part for it. And we've done these things before. And as I mentioned, like I think earlier, there's a lot of things for us to actually just start to work on and get them addressed. And the ones I mentioned before, whether it's accreditation or technical standards, would be examples. So exciting times ahead. Like I think there's a lot of interesting opportunities coming our way.
Thanks, Hugh. I think we're coming up on time, so I think with that, I'd like to kind of conclude our breakout discussion by thanking all of our speakers who are taking out time of their busy schedule to share, I think, incredibly valuable insights, and I think, frankly, leaving a lot of us, I think, leaving more hopeful, right, that we can actually get something done. So it's always a pleasure to engage in open banking discussion with each one of you, and thank you all for joining, and thank you all in the audience for joining us today as well.